Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday, August the 19th, 2025. We seem preoccupied with AI these days, understandably so. A couple of days ago, did a show, our weekly tech roundup with Keith Teare, the publisher of the That Was the Week newsletter. And as always, we talked AI. His startup of the week was one that's promoted by a very successful Silicon Valley venture capitalist, Josh Koppelman. It's a company called Torch, which is a unified health record. And it seems as if the medical industry is figuring out how to monetize AI, particularly generative AI. So there'll be a good opportunity to check in with our authority on medical matters, all medical matters, particularly medical AI matters. Robert Pearl, he's been on the show many times before. His latest book is ChatGPT MD. He's an MD, used to run Kaiser Permanente medical insurance company, one of the leading California-based systems. And he had an interesting piece in Forbes earlier this month on how to monetize Gen I healthcare. So it's a good time to be talking. Robert, as always, welcome back to Keen On.
I always enjoy talking with you. It's always very stimulating. I look forward to today's conversation.
Robert, have you seen this new product, Torch, this unified health record and LLM in one iOS app?
I've not seen that particular one, but I'm pretty familiar with a range of them. And I think it might be helpful for us to help listeners and viewers to understand I'll call it the breadth of AI. You know, we use AI as though it's all one thing, but it's not. And I think you're describing a tool that is trying to combine various pieces. But listeners and viewers have to understand how each is very different, because how you monetize them will be distinctly varied depending upon which model you're trying to sell.
So before we get to those different monetization models, which you lay out, I think, in an intriguing way in your latest Forbes piece, you wrote that before Chat GPT-5 launched. It got launched last week. A lot of skepticism. Later this week, I've got my old friend Gary Marcus, who's perhaps the world's leading skeptic on AI, and particularly of ChatGPT and OpenAI, on the show talking about it. Have you played much with the latest version, ChatGPT 5?
I've used it. I have not played in great detail around it. Most of the biggest advances of that particular application are for programming individuals, people try to program computers, and for much more deep scientific work. I know the company's also made various changes allowing the user to have more control over which model is used for a particular problem. But I should stress the fact that I am very unconcerned whether it's ChatGPT, Gemini, whether it's Claude. I use ChatGPT MD only because the letters flow together. But I think that all the large language models are very similar in performance with slight variation in personality.
Yeah, and of course, you threw your cap in the ring when you wrote ChatGPT MD. I guess it could have been equally entitled Anthropic MD or Gemini MD. Do you think, Robert, speaking as a doctor, someone from your own particular vertical, that there's too much emphasis on AGI and this perfected AI, which will create these remarkably smart machines that are smarter than us? Do you think we should be a little bit more practical in how we think about AI?
I'm not quite sure which question you're asking. Should we be more practical in how fast we want to advance, or more realistic in how fast we are advancing? But to me, AGI is just a term we like, artificial general intelligence. And what's important to understand about it, and this is something that's often missed, is that we have to understand how well this technology does against humans. You can't hold it to a standard of perfection if humans are only 80 or 90% accurate in doing various tasks that are out there. And it's interesting that particularly recently, what we're seeing is that the technology is not only as good, but actually better than. Stanford had a study where it took very complex cases and gave it to skilled clinicians and to a large language model. And the large language model outperformed the clinicians in reaching the right diagnosis. And this is what I think we need to understand. If you look at, take chronic disease, which, by the way, accounts for about 70% of doctors' visits and 70% of medical costs, what you see is that we don't do a very good job of controlling chronic disease. Hypertension, the number one cause of strokes, we control around 60% of the time. Diabetes, the leading cause of heart disease and kidney failure, we control even less well than that. The question we need to be asking is, could we keep people healthier? Could we save more lives if we use a generative AI tool rather than, as today, solely relying on a clinician?
I take your point, Robert, but I've always wondered why people don't listen, not just to their doctor, but to what's written in newspapers and put on media. Everybody knows you only got to spend a few minutes on the internet to recognize that one should eat more carefully and exercise more if you want to look after your health. So why should AI make any difference? Is there a trust issue here? Is it likely perhaps that patients will trust an AI more than a physical doctor like yourself?
Let me offer two parts to the answer there, because we often confuse them or fail to separate them, which is, what type of job do we do? How successful are we helping patients to either prevent or better manage the disease? And this is the and, how successful are doctors able to do? I'm talking about medication adjustment in taking care of patients, let's say, who have diabetes and need to be on insulin. The nice part to me about the generative AI tool is that it has the potential to be able to address both problems. And why do I say that? Because I think a major reason why patients fail to do the things that we would like them to do as clinicians is because they don't have the tools to do it. So as an example, if you want to eat better, how do you figure that out? Well, it's easy with a generative AI tool. Ask for a shopping list, ask for menus, put it in the context of your disease, and you're going to get a lot of good recommendations. Ask about exercise. You'll have a lot of good options there. So I see it as complementary on that side. But more significantly, if you look at what happens, a patient walks in your office, let's say with high blood pressure, and you diagnose it, you prescribe a medication. What do we say to that patient? Come back in 4 months. When they come back in 4 months, the blood pressure is still elevated. We say, oh, this is what's called white coat syndrome, fear that's driving up the blood pressure. Come back in 4 more months. We're now 8 months into the problem and the blood pressure is still elevated. We could take with a blood pressure cuff at home, connected with a Bluetooth, we could connect that to a generative AI tool. We could take 3 readings a day, and after a month, 100 readings, we would know whether a medication adjustment is needed. And it wouldn't require going to the doctor's office. We'd have all the data that is there. And that's where I think the big opportunities are. The data from the CDC says that if we could control chronic disease, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, as well as the leading medical organizations do today, we would save or prevent 30 to 50% of the deaths that happen from heart disease, cancer, kidney failure, and strokes. And we'd save $1.5 trillion. So even if we could achieve 20% of that, it would be remarkable. And yet we don't, tend to take the blame when the patient's chronic disease is not as well controlled. We either blame the patient or we ignore it But as soon as we have a generative AI tool, now we become very critical. I think there's a much better way to provide medical care than what currently exists.
Yeah, and you and I have agreed on this many times we've spoken, particularly given the dysfunctional nature of American healthcare. So then the issue is not so much whether AI has value, but how to monetize it. Is that the key issue now, in your view, Robert? Thinking from the point of view of doctors, from the point of view of Stanford Medical School, from the point of view of actually enabling AI, is the great challenge now, not just for entrepreneurs or medical entrepreneurs, but doctors making money out of this?
Well, I often focus on how do you monetize. As you know, I teach both the Stanford Medical School and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And I point out to my students at the Stanford Graduate School of Business that 9 out of 10 innovative entrepreneurial companies fail. And it's not for lack of a great idea. It's not for lack of work. It's just they run out of money. And so in looking at the monetization, that often determines whether a product will become successful and broadly available, or whether the company will disappear. So that's the first thing. But the second reason why I pointed it out was to really help my readers, people on my podcast, but as well as your listeners and viewers, to separate out two paths that are completely different. And I think we have focused on the first, which is the traditional FDA approval of AI tools. And we've really failed to understand what the current large language models can do, how fast it can be accomplished, and I will say how much less regulatory approval and how much less medical legal risk is being taken with that approach. And so the article is really trying to highlight not one path versus the other. We'll be doing both paths. The first one will be through technology companies and other organizations. It's going to involve the traditional route. It's going to take a large language model. It's going to use a process we call distillation to extract information from it. It's going to do additional training by exposing it to conversations between doctors and patients and nurses and patients in advice centers. And it's going to create very expensive products. And they'll have a lot of application, particularly if they can be embedded inside of some type of what would currently be a...
Jumping in, Robert, why should they be expensive? I mean, these two models, one you call the entrepreneurial tech model, the other, the clinician-led Gen I education model. I want to get to the second one in a second. But why is the entrepreneurial tech model more expensive? I mean, often first generation disruptive technology products are given out for free.
The reason it's so expensive is that, first of all, you've got to distill it, which means you've got to have a lot of engineers and programmers pulling data out. Once it's been distilled, then you've got to add training to it. That's a second cost. And then these products very clearly have to go through FDA approval. And that is a very expensive process. So by the time you put it all together, you're not talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars that companies like Anthropic and OpenAI and Google are spending, but you are talking probably in the tens of millions. On the other hand, these products will sell for a big price because they'll be very effective, they'll be FDA approved, and it's one way to go. And I think for some applications, it may be the better way to go, although we need to recognize that what it will actually do is to replace what today is a lot of human beings, because it will be able to provide expertise, advice, chronic disease management as well or better than the majority of people in those telephone centers and telemedicine companies.
Yeah, and it's worth reminding ourselves that that's what distinguishes the medical industry from other industries. It's so understandably heavily regulated, in some ways perhaps rather like the financial industry, although even more so. So the alternative model from the one that you're a little nervous about because of regulation and the cost is what you call clinician-led Gen A education. But doesn't that require regulation too, Robert, or is that under the radar, so to speak, of the regulator at least?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question, but as I look at it and explore in the article that I wrote, I don't think it can be regulated because the way the FDA regulates artificial intelligence, by the way, the regulations are decades old, is like a drug. It wants to know what's the database on which you train this. Well, the answer is if you're going to use a large language model, there is no database. It's everything on the internet. It's scraped everything it can find from every medical textbook, from every published article. And then it wants to see consistent results. You there, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. Do you want to start that question again?
Do you remember exactly how you asked it?
Yeah, let me remind myself. Hold on. And what happened with your Wi-Fi? It seemed to just break.
I don't know because I have my booster right next to it. So
yeah, it was the okay. Let me re-ask the question. Okay, Robert. So there seem to be you're providing two kind of models: the entrepreneurial tech model that you're nervous about because of regulatory requirements will produce extremely expensive and presumably products that will take a long time to come to market. And then there's something else you introduce in your piece called what you call the clinician-led Gen I education model, another way of making money. Are you suggesting that this second model can be realized under the regulatory wire, so to speak, going around what regulators normally look at, so that there'll be shortcuts for doctors if it's done in this second way through what you call clinician-led Gen I education? Under the radar, under the regulatory radar?
I write this in detail in the article that was published in Forbes. I don't believe it can be regulated. To understand that, you have to understand how the FDA regulates artificial intelligence. And by the way, this is decades old regulations. And it doesn't like it's a drug. It wants to see the data on which it's been trained. Generative AI is not trained on data. It's trained on everything on the internet, including all the medical textbooks, all the published journal articles. And the FDA wants to see consistent outcomes. And with generative AI, it's not consistent because you and I are going to put in different prompts, so we're likely to get slightly different answers. And I believe that the thing we should be doing is comparing the accuracy against humans, but that's not what the FDA does today. And so I think basically that there will not be a regulator over it because it's not a specific product for specific disease, but that has not yet been fully demonstrated. So here's what I believe, which is that if you go into a generative AI tool today, and remember, this technology is doubling in power every year. So by 5 years from now, it's going to be 32 times more powerful. So we're looking at a tool that's going to be far more accurate as each year progresses. And if you ask it today, you put your symptoms in place, I'm going to say it does a really good job of being able to give you the accurate and medically appropriate answer, particularly if once you know how to enter data and to be able to do follow-up questions. So you could say that rather than trying to create a new tool by a technology company for a specific purpose, using multiple data sets, what we're just going to do is use the large language model, which, as you know, is free. If you want the free one, you want to pay $20 a month. We're talking about relatively inexpensive cost per patient. Most people already have it. There's a billion users around the globe. And then you could take the information, if you knew how to do it, put it into place, and you could find out whether your hypertension was under appropriate control or not. You could find out how your diabetes was doing. You could ask a question about your child, their rash, using a multimedia data entry about a particular problem they're having, a symptom they're having. And you could get, I believe, a really accurate answer coming out of it. But what do you need right now? You need to have guidance on how to put the prompt in place, on the kinds of questions to ask, on the follow-up to do, so we could train people, not generally how to use a large language model. People are figuring that out themselves. But to say, if you have diabetes, and I could give you a bunch of other pieces with cardiovascular disease, without cardiovascular disease, with kidney failure, without kidney failure, put that information in place, and you could get the advice that you need to be able to manage these problems. And all of that could be done very quickly. There's a lot of clinicians, 40% of doctors are doing gig work right now. They're looking for these kinds of jobs. It could be done in conjunction with an educational company. It could be done in conjunction with a national medical society. It would need to be tested to be sure it's going to work. People initially would have to still work with their physicians. But I think that relatively quickly what they're going to find is that for more routine problems, for ones for which we have definitive answers, it's actually going to be pretty identical to what your doctor is going to tell you, and far more convenient and fast to do. And then it would be monetized by teaching people how to use the tools that exist today, which would be inexpensive, as opposed to training a model to be able to do all of that for the patient.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument, Robert. You talk about gig work. It reminds me in a way of the original Uber argument about replacing traditional cabs with people who drove their own cars, bring prices down, make it more convenient, better for consumers, better for drivers. There's been an ongoing debate about whether any of that's true. But Uber was successful, in part at least, in the cab business because it was still a relatively lightly regulated industry. But when it comes to the medical business, I mean, you've already talked about regulation, but what about the insurance companies? Are you suggesting that these gig doctors, as you call them, they should be separate from traditional insurance? How is insurance thinking about AI? Do they see it as a threat or an opportunity? You're all too familiar with that. You used to run Kaiser Permanente. You teach not just medicine, but the business of medicine. How is the insurance industry dealing? It seems to me, as a consumer of medical insurance, as everybody else in this country, that the medical industry, the insurance industry, is incredibly reactionary and conservative and hostile to all forms of change.
Well, let me double back and say, at least my knowledge, having lived in New York City, of the introduction of Uber and taxi cabs was different than yours. It was highly regulated. How was it regulated? Through a $30,000 medallion that you had to buy. And you had a restriction on the number of cabs so that the costs would go up. And often you couldn't find one depending upon where you were and whether it was raining or not. And I'm not sure people felt very safe, and they had to have money. And you could go a whole long list of pieces. And today, when I travel a lot, as you know, and when I arrive at an airport, there used to be, huge lines of people waiting to find a cab, and now there's huge lines of cabs waiting to find people.
Right. And it was no coincidence, of course, that Uber was founded and launched in the Bay Area, where the local cabs are particularly bad, and it's a much less regulated system, certainly than New York. But go on.
But going back to your question, I think you have to look at what the insurers would want. And if I am accurate that this would allow costs to come down, I think they would welcome it, because what you would see is that the cost of the premium would drop, And a lot of the things that are happening now, the prior authorization and claims denial would no longer be necessary because costs could actually be reduced, not by restricting care, but by improving health. The people who are going to be challenged by this approach, assuming it's successful, are going to be the current, I'll say in quotes, providers of care, by which I mean hospitals and drug companies. Because if the technology would be able to allow us to avoid chronic disease in the first place and better control it and avoid the heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and kidney failures that otherwise will result, you're going to see hospitals with a lot fewer patients. You're going to see drug companies selling a lot less medication than they otherwise would have. And this, I think, will be where the resistance is. I don't think it's going to be the insurance companies. I agree with you completely. They're not going to lead the way because, as you say, they're risk adverse and they can just charge almost whatever they want because there's not a whole lot of options out there anymore that could compete with it. But I think if it actually was successful, it would make the insurance industry a lot, not only just satisfied today, but elevate its reputation, which, as you know, has gotten soiled in the past decade or two.
You teach at Stanford Medical School, Robert. They're probably amongst, I'm guessing, one of the two or three leading, most exclusive medical schools in the country. It costs an enormous amount of money to be educated there, and it's very selective in who they accept. In this model that you're introducing or musing about, this clinician-led Gen I education model, does that undermine traditional medical education? Does it make places like Stanford more or less valuable? Couldn't any nurse practitioner who learns their way around one of these AI products be equally useful as a doctor? Does this ultimately commodify medical knowledge?
What it will do is commodify the parts that I will say are lower down in the hierarchy of medicine and academic institutions overall, of which Stanford is one of them. You know, what do they pride themselves on? Heart transplants and management and treatment of very major cancers, opportunities for little babies. And these things will not get replaced by generative AI anytime in the near future. I mean, once you go out 20, 30 years, who knows what's going to happen? But in the short run, no. I think that what we're going to see is going to be a shift in that model. And I'm sure you're following very closely what's happening in computer programming, where what you're seeing is that the number of jobs that humans are doing is disappearing. About a third to two-thirds of programmers have gotten replaced, particularly those who I would say the equivalent of what you're describing, who are the newer entrants into the job market. The very skilled individuals still have that role. So no, I don't think an institution like Stanford would have problems with it. I think it's going to be much more a lot of other hospitals that all of a sudden are going to find they don't have as many patients in them, and that's going to create significant difficulties in a hospital environment that has a margin of maybe 3 to 5% each year.
It's the disappearance, once again, of the middle, a familiar feature of the digital revolution. Robert, you and I first came across each other after you came out with a controversial book arguing that most doctors are actually rather miserable. It's not just patients who are miserable and complain about the systems, it's doctors as well. In your view, is this going to be a model, what you call this clinician-led Gen I education model, of monetizing AI, of being under the radar when it comes to the government? Is this likely to make doctors more or less happy?
This is a very important question, Andrew, one you and I have talked about quite often, which is it depends upon whether the reimbursement system for clinicians shifts. If it stays fee for service, I think this will be felt to be a threat because it will diminish the number of patients who are going to be coming into the clinician's office, both because some of the problems will get solved by a generative AI tool and because people will be healthier and not need as much care. But if they can move from a fee for service, a pay for volume, to a pay for value, a capitated system where they get a certain amount of money to take care of a population of patients. And if they can keep them healthy, that's how they do best. That, I believe, will be very synergistic with the model we're talking about. And clinicians, I think, as you said, will be a lot happier. I saw data today that looked at what's happened in terms of the number of patients that a typical doctor in the United States sees per day and their income. And what you see is that they are seeing significantly more patients every day with only a slight bump in their income, about 3% higher income, but 10 to 12% more patients per day. And the reason they're getting burned out, the reason they're unfulfilled, is they're just having to run faster and faster to try to stay in the same place. But by the way, if your revenue only goes up 3 to 4%, but your number of patients goes up 12%, you get to a point at which what you can't do is cover your costs. So I think the misery is still in place. Now, how are doctors responding to that? Many of them are joining, selling their practice to hospitals that are able to consolidate markets and raise prices. This is the dysfunction that you and I both agree upon and have talked about many times before. I think this model of using a generative AI tool to provide a lot of the care to better manage chronic diseases, to do many of the things that today require a visit to an office, to have the patient be able to do it successfully at home, that I think is finally the tool that clinicians need to make this leap from pay for volume to pay for value. But until they do so, I think there will be the kinds of cross currents that you're implying.
As you know, there's always going to be a few high-end graduates of Stanford Medical School who will pioneer heart transplants and all sorts of other seemingly miraculous medical procedures in the 21st century. But the rest of the doctors, as you note, will become perhaps more commodified, certainly more dependent on AI. And as you and I have talked endlessly, and this seems to be the ultimate conclusion of all conversations about AI, the one thing that humans are good at, which AI struggles with, is conversation, is human interaction. So will, Robert, in the future, the thing that, and to some extent, I guess this is probably true today, the thing that will distinguish successful, happy, wealthy doctors from everyone else is their ability to deal with patients in a human-to-human way that has nothing to do with AI, is the reverse of that?
Well, I'd say two things. First, realize we have an immense shortage of doctors in the current healthcare system because the system is so inefficient. It's estimated by the AMA there'll be 100,000 doctor shortage, particularly in primary care, which is where a generative AI tool will be very, very powerful. So I don't think it's a question of doctors not having work to do. I think it's going to be a question of how do we use these tools to improve their outcomes in terms of satisfaction and fulfillment. But I also think that the big evolution is going to be the ability now to make that transformation into a capitated system to keep people healthy, and now to be able to see incomes going up without just simply running faster and faster on that treadmill.
Robert, you wrote an interesting piece in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about Donald Trump changing healthcare by cutting. He seems to be an expert cutter, takes pride in that. I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation, but there seems to be two things going on simultaneously. On the one hand, we have this AI revolution that changes everything in the information economy and with information professionals. On the other hand, we have the crisis of traditional institutions, of elites, which Trump has fed so successfully into. Are these two phenomena connected? Is it any coincidence that we get AI at the same time as we're suffering a scarcity of trust in larger institutions, in doctors, in education and healthcare?
Well, there's no relationship between the technological people who developed a generative AI tool and all these other parts that are now sitting in the political and societal spheres. I think the question really is going to be how will this technology impact that? And it's also why I'm optimistic, because what we're going to see is a growing problem with equity. We're going to see is that if you have money, you can get good healthcare in this country. Doctors would love to have you. They want your insurance. Maybe you'll have some direct primary care or some concierge service. The people with money, they have about a 90-year life expectancy. It's the other half of the
It's
population.
more than half, Robert. It's probably more like 80 or 90%, isn't it?
Well, it is, but there's a middle group, but there's half of the nation who are really struggling, whose life expectancy, the average is about 78 for men and 82 for women. They're down at low 70s. They have a lot of medical problems. And all the things that are happening, the piece that I wrote about having to do with what's going to happen in Medicaid and to people on the healthcare exchanges, is that they're going to find it increasingly impossible to obtain medical coverage. They're not going to get care. If they get care, it'll always be in the ER, which can't by law reject them. And we're going to see a growing discrepancy. And so this gets back to a point you made very early in our conversation today. Maybe as in a traditional disruptive model, there'll be these people who rely on a generative AI tool, particularly a free one, to be the first people to get access to it. But what I believe is that even for the people who can get great healthcare, to see a doctor 1 month and come back 4 months later and have no idea what's happening in the middle, if we have a tool that will let you know how you're doing, personalized to you, I think you're going to like that. Now, you see a mental health professional and you have another visit a week from now. What happens in the intermediate 6 days? We have no idea. We now have a tool that can assist in that process. We need to see the gaps in care, even for the best insured Americans today, not because doctors aren't working hard. They're working very hard, but because the problems that we have are ones that require continuous care, and that simply is not possible for any clinician to provide.
Yeah, and that's why I think the product that Koppelman is writing about is now running tests, Torch is a no-brainer. I'm actually amazed it hasn't appeared earlier. But it will, of course, be used by men, particularly men, but not only men, like Josh Koppelman, a very wealthy venture capitalist in Silicon Valley around Palo Alto. And one wonders about the middle. Two more questions, Robert. You're always so generous with your time, but I know you've got to run. I mentioned Trump earlier. Again, I don't want to turn this into a Trump conversation, but we spoke at the beginning of the year about RFK. You were cautiously optimistic, unusually optimistic, I thought, given the ridicule that some people, particularly in California, have towards RFK. What's his report on the first 6 months of American medicine under RFK?
Well, I would say that I was not positive, I was very negative about his vaccine approach. But in terms of the possibility of improving health through better nutrition and a variety of other ways.
MAHA, as he calls it, Make America Healthy Again.
And last week, someone released, it was not officially released, a draft, which I was very disappointed in because it didn't do the things that were necessary. It said they're going to study chronic disease. We don't need to study chronic disease. We know what causes it. We know the dietary problems. And I think that he has just given way to the agricultural industry, which I was hopeful that he might be able to buck. And I would say I'm more negative and pessimistic now. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, give him the room to run. And I would love to have seen this talk about ways to force the industry to be able to provide and both provide healthier food and to label the food that's not. I'd like to have seen some restrictions, like we do cigarettes and alcohol. Give kids a lot of the high sugar, high fat foods and sodas. You're going to have people with an obesity problem across their life. We are doing things with negative consequences. And I was hopeful that he would step in. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I've not seen the final report because it's not out yet. But if the final report looks like the preliminary one that I've seen, I will say that he will have gotten an F in that arena as well.
Oh dear. Well, finally, last week we had Geoffrey Hinton on the show, won the Nobel Prize last year for physics, the so-called godfather of AI. He's very pessimistic in other ways about AI. He was one of the inventors of generative AI, perhaps the inventor. What he argued on the show, Robert, is that we need to, and I'm quoting him carefully, feminize AI, make it softer, more sympathetic. Do you think that's also true when it comes to applying AI to medicine? That it's less of a technological issue and more of a cultural one?
I know a lot about him. I have massive respect for him, and I've actually read some of the pieces that he's written on this topic. He was basically saying, wake up, this technology will be smarter than humans. He didn't give an exact number of years to get there. And if we want it to work in our favor, we needed to get it to care about us. And that's where he used the maternal model to get there. I don't know. That may be a way to go. I'm actually less worried than other people are that this technology will get to the point where it has enough personal identity to decide that it wants to do something terrible. I'm much more afraid of the humans and how they're going to use it than I am of the machines and the underlying technology itself.
Well, Robert Pearl, MD, author of ChatGPT, MD, fascinating book out about how to apply AI to medicine. You've given it a great deal of thought. As always, a pleasure and an honor, Robert. Best of luck with everything. And we will talk certainly by the end of the year about how AI continues to change the medical industry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.